The rain had just stopped on that cold October evening, leaving the streets of Oak Hills glistening under the streetlights. Officer Wilson was parked in his usual spot near Cedar Lane, his dashboard computer glowing softly as he finished logging his previous traffic stop. He took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee, his 20th year on the force weighing heavily on his mind. That's when he spotted the black Mercedes S-Class coming down the road. The car was doing nothing wrong. It was well maintained, moving at a reasonable speed, and following all traffic laws. But something about seeing such an expensive car in this neighborhood at this hour made Wilson's old habits kick in. He watched as the car smoothly navigated the wet roads, its driver seemingly unaware of the scrutiny. Without really thinking it through, Wilson pulled out and followed the Mercedes. His mind was already building a story, probably some kid who borrowed Daddy's car, or maybe something more suspicious. He'd done this hundreds of times before, and his gut instincts rarely led him wrong, or so he believed. The Mercedes driver noticed the patrol car and did everything by the book, maintained speed, used turn signals, kept proper distance from other vehicles. This somehow irritated Wilson even more. After following for 2 blocks, he hit the lights. The Mercedes pulled over perfectly, stopping in a well-lit area where security cameras from the nearby bank provided clear coverage of the scene. Wilson approached the car, flashlight in hand, its beam reflecting off the luxury vehicle's pristine paint. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a man in his 40s wearing what was clearly an expensive suit. The driver's hands were already on the steering wheel, his movements deliberate and calm. "License and registration," Wilson said, his tone carrying that edge of authority he perfected over the years. The driver spoke with a distinguished voice. "Of course, officer. I'm reaching for my credentials in my inside jacket pocket." His measured words and professional demeanor should have put Wilson at ease, but something kept nagging at him. The driver pulled out a leather wallet, and Wilson caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach tighten. A gold badge. But before the driver could fully explain, Wilson's pride and prejudice kicked in. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand instinctively moving to his belt. The driver's expression changed ever so slightly, not fear or anger, but something more like resignation, as if he'd been through this before. "Officer, I think there's something you should know." He started, but Wilson cut him off. "Out of the vehicle." What happened next would change everything, though Wilson didn't know it yet. As the driver stepped out, his jacket moved just enough to reveal a shoulder holster. Wilson's training took over, and within seconds, he had the man pressed against the car. In his rush to assert control, Wilson missed the federal ID that fell from the driver's pocket, skittering across the wet pavement. Little did Wilson know that across town, a team of federal agents was waiting for their lead investigator to arrive at a crucial briefing. Every minute of this unnecessary stop was delaying an operation that had been months in the making. The night was about to become much longer than either man had planned, and Wilson's world was about to turn upside down. The security cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of what would soon become a turning point in both men's lives. A simple traffic stop that would spark a chain of events nobody could have predicted. And this was just the beginning. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Wilson's flashlight beam bounced off the Mercedes' polished surface as he conducted what he thought would be a routine pat-down. His hand brushed against something solid under the driver's designer jacket, and his whole body tensed up. "Weapon. Don't move," he barked, immediately drawing his own firearm. "Officer, I'm trying to tell you. I'm a federal agent," the driver said calmly, his voice steady despite having a gun pointed at him. The rain had started again, a light drizzle that made everything shimmer under the streetlights. "Sure you are," Wilson scoffed, his mind already made up about what was happening here. He'd heard every excuse in the book during his years on the force. The driver kept his hands visible, spread against the car's wet surface. "My credentials are on the ground, right by your feet. Just take a look." But Wilson wasn't listening anymore. His pride, mixed with years of ingrained assumptions, had taken over. He reached for his handcuffs while keeping his weapon trained on the driver. From the nearby houses, lights were starting to come on. Curious faces peeked through windows, some residents already holding up phones to record what was happening. Wilson noticed but didn't care. He was sure he was in the right. He'd found an armed man in an expensive car in a neighborhood where he didn't belong. As Wilson started to cuff the driver, a call came in over his radio. He ignored it. Another call followed immediately. Unusual for this time of night. The driver sighed, a sound not of fear or anger, but of tired familiarity with the situation. "That's probably about me," he said quietly. "Your dispatch is likely getting some very interesting calls right now." Wilson tightened the cuffs, perhaps a bit more roughly than necessary. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, but the driver cut him off. Something suspects rarely dared to do. "Officer, I know my rights probably better than you do. I've taught courses on constitutional law at Quantico." There was something in his voice that made Wilson hesitate for just a second. A few drops of rain slid down the driver's face as he turned slightly toward Wilson. "In about 5 minutes, this street is going to be filled with federal vehicles. I have a team waiting for me to lead a major operation tonight. Every minute you waste here puts that operation at risk." He spoke with the confidence of someone used to being in charge, used to having his words carry weight. But Wilson had come too far to back down now. "Yeah? Well, until those federal vehicles show up, you're still in my custody." He opened the back door of his patrol car, the blue and red lights still painting the scene in alternate colors. The driver looked at him with what seemed like genuine concern, not for himself, but for Wilson. "I'm going to give you one last chance to pick up that ID by your feet," the driver said as Wilson guided him toward the patrol car. "What happens in the next few minutes will determine whether this becomes a learning experience or a career-ending mistake." Wilson's radio crackled again, more urgently this time. He could hear the strain in the dispatcher's voice, something he'd never noticed before. In the distance, he thought he heard sirens, a lot of them. But his stubborn pride wouldn't let him bend. He had found an armed man, and he was going to do this by the book, his book. As he closed the patrol car door, Wilson finally glanced down at the ground. There, face up in a shallow puddle, lay an FBI badge and ID, the gold shield catching the rotating lights of his patrol car. His stomach dropped, but before he could process what he was seeing, the quiet street erupted with the sound of squealing tires and sirens. The consequences of his actions were about to become very, very real. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Wilson paced nervously in the break room, his coffee going cold for the 3rd time. The events of the last hour played through his mind like a bad movie he couldn't turn off. The street had erupted into organized chaos. Black SUVs, federal agents in tactical gear, and his supervisor's face turning several shades of red he'd never seen before. "Wilson." The sharp voice of Captain Reynolds cut through his thoughts. "My office. Now." The walk down the hallway felt like the longest of his career. Other officers avoided eye contact, suddenly very interested in their paperwork. The whispers followed him like shadows. Inside the captain's office, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The FBI assistant director was there, his presence filling the room. The man Wilson had arrested sat calmly in a chair, now free of handcuffs, looking through some papers. He'd taken off his wet jacket, his shoulder holster and FBI badge clearly visible. "Officer Wilson," the assistant director's voice was controlled but cold. "Do you realize you've just delayed a 6-month federal investigation? Agent Chen here was supposed to be leading a task force operation tonight." Wilson's throat went dry. Agent Chen, the man he'd arrested, looked up from his papers with an unreadable expression. Captain Reynolds leaned forward on his desk. "Do you have any idea how many protocols you violated tonight? Any idea at all?" He held up his phone, showing a video already going viral on social media. Wilson watched himself on the small screen, aggressively handcuffing a calm, well-dressed federal agent while ignoring his credentials on the ground. I thought. Wilson started, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he'd seen an expensive car and made assumptions. That he'd let his prejudices override his training. That he'd been so sure he was right. He hadn't even bothered to check the ID that had been literally at his feet. Agent Chen finally spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle. The operation had to be completely restructured. My team managed to adapt, but we lost our element of surprise. 6 months of work, compromised in minutes. He wasn't angry. Somehow that made it worse. Though I suppose we should be grateful. This incident has exposed some concerning patterns in local law enforcement that need addressing. The assistant director nodded grimly. We've pulled your stop records for the past 5 years, Officer Wilson. The pattern is troubling. He slid a folder across the desk. Wilson didn't need to open it. He knew what they'd found: the disproportionate number of stops, the selective enforcement, the subtle and not so subtle biases that had colored his judgment year after year. A knock at the door interrupted them. Another agent entered, whispering something to Chen. They're moving now, Chen said, standing up. If you'll excuse me, I need to try to salvage what's left of our operation. He paused at the door, looking back at Wilson. Officer, I hope you understand. What happens next isn't personal. It's about accountability. Captain Reynolds waited until Chen and the assistant director left before speaking again. Internal Affairs will be here in the morning. Your badge and gun, please. Wilson's hands shook as he placed them on the desk. 20 years of service, and it had all come down to this moment. Go home, Wilson, the captain said, suddenly sounding very tired. Use this time to think about why you do this job. About who you really want to be as an officer. As Wilson turned to leave, the captain added, and Wilson, Agent Chen did us a favor by not filing criminal charges. Remember that. Walking out of the station that night, Wilson felt the weight of every mistake, every unchecked bias, every moment he'd let prejudice guide his actions. The rain had stopped, but the night felt darker than ever. As he reached his car, he saw Agent Chen's team deploying for the revised operation, their movements precise and professional. He watched them disappear into the night, realizing that tomorrow would bring a very different kind of challenge. Facing himself in the mirror, the morning sun peeped through Wilson's kitchen window, casting long shadows across his untouched breakfast. 3 days had passed since the incident, but his phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. The video had gone viral, millions of views, thousands of comments. His face was plastered across news websites, social media, and even the local paper lying on his kitchen table. His daughter called again, the 5th time that morning. She was away at college, studying law enforcement ironically enough. Dad, please pick up, her text read. We need to talk about this. But what could he say to her? How could he explain to his own child that her father had become exactly the kind of officer they'd always criticized together? The TV in his living room droned on with the morning news. Local officer suspended pending investigation into racial profiling incident involving federal agent. He clicked it off, but the silence felt even worse. The walls of his house seemed to close in around him, filled with photos of his police academy graduation, awards from his early years, moments when he'd felt proud to wear the badge. His phone rang again. This time, it was his partner, Rodriguez. After 3 rings, he finally answered. You can't hide forever, Rodriguez said, skipping the hello. The department's mandatory sensitivity training starts today. Captain says you need to be there. Wilson rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. I'm suspended, remember? Yeah, and this is part of your review process, Rodriguez replied. Look, man, you messed up. Big time. But hiding at home, watching the world tear you apart, isn't going to fix anything. There was a pause. The FBI agents' task force, they pulled off their operation despite everything. Got some major players off the street. No thanks to you. The guilt hit Wilson like a physical blow. He thought about Agent Chen, how composed he'd remained throughout the entire ordeal. How professional. How much better of an officer he'd been than Wilson that night. A knock at his door made him jump. Through the peephole, he saw 2 internal affairs officers waiting patiently. He'd been expecting them, but it still felt surreal. Opening the door, he noticed his neighbors watching from their windows. The same neighbors who'd brought him Christmas cookies last year now looked at him like a stranger. Officer Wilson, the female IA investigator said, her tone professional, but not unkind. We need to go through your patrol records for the past 5 years. All stops, arrests, and incidents. The male investigator added, we'll do this here if you prefer. Save you the walk of shame through the station. For the next 4 hours, they combed through his career, spread out across his dining room table. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every decision he'd made was laid bare. The patterns were impossible to ignore. The disproportionate stops, the selective enforcement, the times he'd let suspects go with a warning versus the times he brought down the full force of the law. You were a good officer once, the female investigator said, looking through his early records. Your first few years show a different pattern. What changed? Wilson stared at the papers, seeing his career transform from year to year. When had he started seeing threats instead of people? When had he let bias cloud his judgment? His phone buzzed again. Another text from his daughter. Dad, I'm coming home this weekend. We're going to fix this together. The message hit him hard. His daughter still believed in him, still thought he could change. Maybe she was right. The afternoon sun cast different shadows now as the IA officers packed up their files. The department's giving you a chance, the male investigator said at the door. That sensitivity training, it's not just a checkbox. Use it. His partner added, Agent Chen's recommendation carried weight. Don't waste this opportunity. As their car pulled away, Wilson looked at his reflection in the window. The same face looked back at him, but somehow everything was different. His phone buzzed one more time. A message from Rodriguez. Training starts at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll pick you up. Time to start over, partner. For the first time in days, Wilson felt something close to hope. The road ahead would be hard, but maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was the beginning of a better one. The Diversity Training Center looked nothing like Wilson expected. No sterile classroom, no dreary PowerPoint presentations. Instead, he found himself in a modern space with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. 2 weeks had passed since the incident, and this was his first day back in any official capacity. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another message from his daughter. Proud of you for doing this, Dad. Her support had been unwavering, even after watching that viral video countless times. She'd stayed home the entire weekend, helping him face the reality of his actions, challenging him to be better. As other officers filed in, Wilson noticed he wasn't the only one looking uncomfortable. Then the room fell silent as Agent Chen walked in, dressed in casual clothes rather than his usual suit. Good morning, everyone, he said, taking a seat in the circle. I'm not here as an FBI agent today. I'm here as someone who wants to have an honest conversation. Wilson's heart raced. Nobody had told him Agent Chen would be here. Their eyes met across the room, and to Wilson's surprise, the agent gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. No anger, no accusation, just recognition. Before we start, Agent Chen began, I want to share something personal. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a small scar. 10 years ago, another officer pulled me over. I wasn't FBI then, just a young lawyer heading home from work. Things escalated, much like our recent incident. He paused, letting his words sink in. That officer never got the chance I'm offering today. the chance to understand and change. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. Wilson found himself leaning forward, drawn in by the raw honesty in Agent Chen's voice. "I could have filed charges after our encounter," he continued, looking directly at Wilson. "Instead, I saw an opportunity, not just for sensitivity training, but for real understanding." Agent Chen stood up and walked to the center of the circle. "Each of us has biases. They're like invisible weights we carry without realizing. The trick isn't pretending they don't exist. It's recognizing them and choosing to put them down." He pulled out his FBI badge, turning it over in his hands. "This shield means something. So does yours. But it's not just about enforcing laws. It's about protecting everyone's dignity." For the next hour, Agent Chen shared stories, times he'd faced discrimination, moments when he'd overcome prejudice, and instances where he'd seen real change happen. Wilson listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his career. Other officers shared too, their fears, their assumptions, their desire to do better. Then Agent Chen did something unexpected. He pulled out a case file. "Remember that operation you interrupted?" Wilson's stomach tightened. "We still caught the bad guys, but here's what you missed by not looking past your assumptions that night." He opened the file, revealing photos of a diverse task force in action, working seamlessly together to protect their community. "Officer Wilson," Agent Chen said, "would you join me up here?" Wilson's legs felt like lead as he stood. Every eye in the room was on him. "Tell him what you saw that night. Not what you assumed, but what you actually saw before your biases took over." Taking a deep breath, Wilson began to speak. He described the well-maintained car, the professional demeanor, the calm compliance. All the signs he'd ignored because they didn't fit his preconceptions. His voice shook at first, but grew stronger as he continued. "That's bravery," Agent Chen said when Wilson finished. "Not the kind that chases down suspects, but the kind that faces hard truths about yourself." He turned to address the whole room. "This isn't about shame. It's about growth. Every one of us has the power to change, to be better tomorrow than we were yesterday." As the session wrapped up, Agent Chen approached Wilson privately. "Same time next week?" he asked. "I think you're ready for the next step." Wilson looked at him confused. "Next step?" Agent Chen smiled. "Building bridges takes more than one day, Officer Wilson. Are you willing to do the work?" For the first time since that rainy night, Wilson felt something shift inside him. "Yes," he said, meaning it more than any word he'd ever spoken. "I'm ready." The community center buzzed with activity as Wilson walked in, now a month after the incident. Kids played basketball in one corner, while elderly folks chatted over coffee in another. Agent Chen had suggested he spend time here as part of his learning process, though Wilson still wasn't sure why. "Officer Wilson," called out Mrs. Lee, the center's director, her warm smile catching him off guard. "The youth group is about to start. Would you like to join?" He nodded, following her through the crowded hallway. The walls were covered with artwork and photographs showing the neighborhood's rich history. Inside the meeting room, teenagers of all backgrounds sat in a circle, some looking at him with obvious distrust. They'd seen the video. Everyone had. But that was why he was here. Agent Chen's words echoed in his mind. Real change happens face to face, one conversation at a time. "Today," Mrs. Lee announced, "Officer Wilson is here to listen to your experiences with law enforcement." His throat tightened. This wasn't going to be easy, but that was the point. A young boy raised his hand first, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "My dad taught me exactly how to act if I get pulled over," the boy said. "Hands on the wheel, no sudden movements, yes sir, no sir. I was 12 when he gave me that talk." Other kids nodded, sharing similar stories. Wilson listened, really listened, feeling the weight of each word. A girl in hijab spoke next. "Last month, someone called the police on me for studying in the park. They said I looked suspicious. She met Wilson's eyes. The officer who responded, he made things worse, not better. Story after story poured out. Some made Wilson want to defend his profession, explain procedures, justify actions. But he remembered Agent Chen's advice. Don't respond, don't defend. Just listen and learn. So he did, each story hitting him like a gentle hammer, breaking down walls he hadn't even known he built. Later that afternoon, he sat in his regular session with Agent Chen, processing what he'd heard. It's different when you see them as people, isn't it? Agent Chen asked. Not statistics, not potential threats, just kids trying to live their lives. Wilson nodded, thinking about his own daughter. I keep wondering how many times I've been that officer they talked about. How many kids I've scared without realizing it. He pulled out his notebook. He'd started keeping one, writing down thoughts and revelations. I always thought I was doing my job, keeping people safe. But safe for who? Agent Chen smiled slightly. That's the right question to ask. Safety isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about building trust. When people fear those who should protect them, something's broken. He pulled out some files. These are complaints filed against officers in your precinct over the past year. Read them. See the patterns. As Wilson flipped through the pages, he saw his own biases reflected in his colleagues' actions. Traffic stops that went too far, unnecessary escalations, subtle and not so subtle discrimination. We can do better, he said quietly. We have to do better. That's why I invited you here, Agent Chen revealed. Next week, you're going to help me train other officers. Share what you've learned. Your story, your journey, it matters. Wilson looked up, surprised. Me? But I'm the one who messed up. Exactly, Agent Chen replied. You messed up, owned it, and chose to change. That's more powerful than 1,000 lectures. He gestured to the community center outside the window. These people don't need perfect officers. They need human ones. Officers who can admit mistakes and grow from them. As Wilson drove home that evening, he passed the spot where he'd stopped Agent Chen that rainy night. The street looked different now, or maybe he was the one who'd changed. His phone buzzed. A message from his daughter. How was today? He smiled, typing back. I learned something important. Want to hear about it over dinner? Her response came quickly. Already on my way. Proud of you, Dad. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow, he'd be back at the community center, learning more, listening more. It wasn't about checking boxes or completing requirements anymore. It was about becoming the officer he should have been all along, the officer his community deserved. The FBI field office looked imposing from the outside, all glassed and steel rising into the morning sky. Wilson adjusted his civilian clothes, no uniform today, and checked his visitor's badge one more time. 2 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and here he was, about to see law enforcement from a completely different angle. Agent Chen met him in the lobby, wearing his trademark suit but sporting a friendly smile. Ready to see how we do things here? He asked, leading Wilson through security. The halls buzzed with activity, agents of all backgrounds working together seamlessly. It was like watching a well-choreographed dance. This morning, we're planning a major operation, Agent Chen explained, guiding Wilson into a briefing room. I want you to see how diversity makes us stronger. The room was filled with agents, men and women from every imaginable background, each bringing their unique perspectives to the table. The case involved a complex network of criminals operating across different communities. As Wilson watched the briefing unfold, he noticed something remarkable. Each agent contributed cultural insights that proved invaluable to the operation. One agent's understanding of local customs helped identify patterns. Another's language skills opened doors that might have remained closed. See that agent there? Agent Chen whispered, pointing to a woman leading the tactical planning. She used to face the same prejudices you showed that night. Now she's one of our best field commanders." Wilson watched her confidently direct the team, earning respect not through force, but through competence and understanding. During lunch, Wilson sat with a group of agents, listening to their stories. One talked about growing up in a neighborhood where police were feared, not trusted. Now he worked to bridge that gap. Another shared how her accent once made people doubt her abilities, but those same cultural connections now helped her crack cases others couldn't. "The old way of policing," Agent Chen said as they observed afternoon training exercises, was about power over people. "Our way is about power with people." The agents demonstrated their approach: de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity in action, community engagement strategies. Wilson thought about his own past tactics, comparing them to what he was seeing. "We're trained to take control of situations," he said, "but I'm starting to think we misunderstood what that means." Agent Chen nodded. "Control through respect is stronger than control through fear." The afternoon brought a real-time operation. From the command center, Wilson watched the diverse team execute their plan flawlessly. They moved through different communities, adapting their approach based on cultural understanding. When they made arrests, it was done with firmness, but also with dignity. "Notice how they communicate," Agent Chen pointed out. "They speak multiple languages, understand different customs. That's not just being nice, it's being effective." Wilson watched as an agent calmed a suspect's elderly grandmother in her native language, turning a potentially volatile situation into a peaceful resolution. Later, during the operation debrief, Wilson was invited to share his thoughts. "I've been a cop for 20 years, he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But today, I saw what it really means to protect and serve everyone." The agents listened respectfully, some nodding in understanding. As the day wound down, Agent Chen took Wilson to his office. Photos lined the walls, not just of successful operations, but of community outreach events, cultural celebrations, graduation ceremonies at the academy. "This is what modern law enforcement looks like," he said. "Every face in these photos makes us better at our job." Walking to his car that evening, Wilson felt a profound shift in his understanding. His phone buzzed. A text from Rodriguez, his old partner. "How was the FBI today? Learn anything good?" Wilson smiled, typing back, "More than good. Want to grab coffee tomorrow? There's something I think we need to talk about." The city lights were coming on, painting the streets in a soft glow. In his rearview mirror, Wilson caught sight of the FBI building. He thought about all the officers back at his precinct, still doing things the old way. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but now he knew what was possible. More importantly, he knew how to help make it happen. The neighborhood park bustled with activity on this bright Saturday morning. Wilson, now back on active duty after 3 months, walked his beat without his usual patrol car. The changes in how people reacted to him were subtle but significant. Kids playing basketball waved instead of stopping their game. Shop owners offered friendly nods rather than wary glances. "Officer," called out an elderly man from his porch. It was Mr. Thompson, who once would have hurried inside at the sight of a police officer. "Would you join us for some tea?" Wilson checked his watch. His new approach to community policing meant making time for these moments. He climbed the porch steps, accepting a cup of steaming tea. "You're different now," Mr. Thompson said simply, pouring another cup for his wife. "We've noticed. The whole neighborhood has." Wilson sat listening as the couple shared stories about their 50 years in the community, about times when police were seen as enemies, and about their hopes for change. Later that day, Wilson led a community meeting at the local library. The room was packed. Residents, business owners, teenagers, and even some fellow officers who'd been skeptical of his new methods. 6 months ago," Wilson began, "I made a mistake that opened my eyes. Today, I want to hear your ideas about how we can serve you better." One by one, people stood up to speak. A store owner talked about feeling profiled during routine business checks. A high school teacher shared how her students feared police encounters. A grandmother worried about her grandsons walking home at night. Instead of becoming defensive, Wilson did what he learned. He listened. His radio crackled with a call, possible trouble at the youth center. In the past, he would have rushed in with lights and sirens. Now, he walked in calmly to find two teenagers in a heated argument. Mrs. Lee, the center director, watched approvingly as Wilson sat down with the boys, talking through their conflict instead of immediately asserting authority. "Remember when you first started coming here?" Mrs. Lee said afterward. "These kids were so scared of you. Look at them now." The teenagers were back to playing basketball. Their argument resolved without handcuffs or threats. "That's real police work," she added, smiling. During his lunch break, Wilson met with Rodriguez and other officers at their usual diner. "I don't get it," one rookie said. "Aren't we supposed to be tough on crime?" Wilson put down his coffee. "Being tough doesn't mean being harsh. Watch this." He waved to a group of teenagers entering the diner, calling them over. The teens approached cautiously at first, but their faces lit up when they recognized Wilson. They were from the community center's youth program. "Tell them what happened last week," Wilson encouraged. One boy spoke up, describing how Wilson had helped him report a crime in his neighborhood, making him feel safe rather than scared. Back at the station, Wilson noticed changes there too. The bulletin board, once filled with wanted posters, now included community event flyers. Officers discussed cultural sensitivity alongside tactical training. Even the captain had started requiring regular community engagement hours. "Your reports look different," the captain mentioned during their weekly meeting. "More detailed, more human." Wilson nodded. "I'm seeing people now, sir. Not just suspects or statistics." The captain pushed a folder across his desk. "The complaint rates in your sector are down 60%. Whatever you're doing, it's working." As his shift ended, Wilson stopped by a local basketball court where he'd once made countless suspicious person stops. Today, he joined a quick game, still in uniform. Parents watched from the sidelines, some taking pictures, not as evidence against police misconduct, but as memories of positive change. His phone buzzed, a message from Agent Chen. "Heard about your community program. The FBI Academy wants you to speak next month. Ready to share your story?" Wilson watched the kids playing basketball, remembering how far he'd come from that rainy night of the traffic stop. "Ready," he typed back. As he walked to his car, a young girl ran up to him. "Officer Wilson, Mom says you're helping make our neighborhood better." He knelt down to her level. "No, sweetheart. Your neighborhood is helping make me better." Her smile reminded him why every small change mattered. This wasn't just about being a better officer. It was about building a better community, one interaction at a time. 1 year had passed since that fateful rainy night. The police academy auditorium was filled to capacity. New recruits, veteran officers, and community leaders gathered for what had become a milestone presentation. Wilson stood at the podium, Agent Chen beside him, looking out at the eager faces. "A year ago," Wilson began, his voice steady, "I was the officer who made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Today, I'm here to tell you how that mistake changed not just my career, but our entire department." The screen behind him showed images of community events, youth programs, and officers engaging with residents in new ways. His daughter sat in the front row, now a rookie officer herself, beaming with pride. She'd chosen to follow in his footsteps, not despite his past mistake, but because of how he'd grown from it. Next to her sat Mr. Thompson and his wife, the elderly couple from his beat who'd become like family. "Real change," Wilson continued, "isn't about policies on paper. It's about the small moments." He shared stories. The basketball games with neighborhood kids, the tea with elderly residents, the tough conversations that turned into breakthrough moments. Each story showed how building trust had made their work more effective, not less. Agent Chen stepped forward, adding his perspective. Officer Wilson's story could have ended with that traffic stop. Instead, it became a beginning. He described how their partnership had led to a new training program, now being adopted by departments across the state. A video played on the screen. Interviews with community members describing the transformation they'd witnessed. Shop owners talked about feeling protected rather than policed. Teenagers shared how they now saw officers as allies rather than threats. Even former critics of the department spoke about positive changes they'd observed. During the break, Wilson walked through the academy halls with Agent Chen. "Remember when you first brought me here?" Wilson asked, stopping by the Wall of Honor. "I thought my career was over." Agent Chen smiled. "Instead, you helped change what that career means." The afternoon session focused on practical changes. Wilson and his team demonstrated their new approach to routine calls. How taking time to understand cultural contexts led to better outcomes. How building relationships prevented crimes instead of just solving them. Last month, Wilson shared, "We had a potentially dangerous situation at the community center." He described how a young man had come in, angry and armed. "In the past, we might have gone in with guns drawn. Instead, we knew him from our youth program. We talked him down, got him help. No shots fired, no lives ruined." The statistics backed up their approach. Crime rates had dropped. Complaint files had thinned. Most importantly, community surveys showed a dramatic increase in trust. "We're not just enforcing laws," Wilson explained. "We're building bridges." As the presentation concluded, a new recruit raised her hand. "But doesn't this take more time?" "More resources." Wilson nodded. "It does. But ask yourself, what's the cost of doing it the old way? What's the price of lost trust?" The day ended with a community dinner in the academy cafeteria. Officers and residents sharing meals and stories together. Wilson watched as his daughter chatted with Mrs. Lee from the community center, both of them laughing over shared memories. His phone buzzed. A message from the captain. "City Council approved our community policing budget. Your program's going department-wide." Another message followed, this one from Agent Chen. "Ready to take this statewide." Looking around the room, Wilson saw the future of law enforcement, not in the weapons or tactics, but in the relationships being built. Young officers learned from community elders. Kids showed police officers their favorite games. Trust was being rebuilt, one conversation at a time. As the evening wound down, Wilson stood in the academy parking lot with his daughter. "You know," she said, "that traffic stop video is still online. But now the comments are different. People share it as a story of change, not just another scandal." The stars were coming out as they walked to their cars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that change was possible. But tonight, watching officers and community members leave together, sharing plans for future projects, Wilson knew that his biggest mistake had led to his most important lesson. That true protection comes from connection, not control. "Ready to head home?" his daughter asked. Wilson looked back at the academy one last time. "Actually," he smiled, "I think we're just getting started."